partners at the Museum in Bristol. So, and at the end, I'll say something about next month's talk, because you all want. Well, a little bit of housekeeping. Back to talking about the chat box, please keep that exclusively for saying hello to everybody. If you have a question for our speaker, please drop that into the Q&A box so you can see the. And we need to keep these two things separate, really. I'll field as many of those questions as we have time for to Owen at the end. We must finish at about 7:30. I may not get through all of them. If you want to make use of closed captions, you should be able to see on the right-hand side of your screen there is a little box you can toggle on and off to allow them or disallow them. That's up to you. Finally, because there's so many of you, can I ask you please to remember to log off from the talk promptly when it ends, because we have to wait for everybody to leave before we can go. So we can't go home till you do. So if you're out of the room at the time, at 7:30, do please remember to run back in and log yourselves out. Right, let me introduce our guest this evening, Professor Owen Davies from the University of Hertfordshire. Now, Owen has published very widely over the last 20 years or so on cultural, folkloric and social histories of belief in magic, in enchantment, devils, witchcraft, and in ghosts, and the impact of these beliefs on neighbourhood relations, on public order, agriculture. I mean, unusually, Owen has placed particular emphasis on how these things have worked out in the modern era. We often think of witchcraft as being a much older set of practices. So what I mean by that is Owen's work has often emphasised this sort of overlooked persistence of magical belief and tradition in the 19th and 20th centuries. And in all these multifaceted approaches, Owen's always been a little bit drawn to the southwest, I think it's fair to say, and to Somerset in particular, where some other aspects of popular belief have also proved remarkably resilient, including the shaming rituals of rough music, skimmington, for example. Well, Owen devoted an early book to witchcraft and magic in 19th century Somerset, in 1999, and in a more sideways look at the same subject, he's also written on themes of magic and witchcraft in the early 20th century novel of Walter Raymond. So anyway, tonight he's going to put all this work into a broader regional and interregional context. And his subject is witchcraft, magic and society in 19th century Somerset. So Owen, if you're ready, please start sharing your screen and away you go.
Okay. Right, I have unmuted. Sorry, I just like to put my muting there. Thank you very much, Steve, for the invitation, and to Bristol Museums for the invitation to talk. And it's really good to catch up on this. I haven't talked about Somerset witchcraft for quite a long time. There's kind of three parts to this talk. First part, I'm going to talk about the actual process of the research, how you go about it, how do you go about finding, researching witchcraft and magic in the 19th century. And then we'll look at some of the findings from the Somerset research, a lot of which I actually conducted a long time ago, as kind of Steve mentioned, but I have kind of updated it, particularly as I'll talk about when it came to the digitisation of newspapers, opened up interesting new aspects. And then kind of the third section, we'll be looking at Somerset and the experience of Somerset with witchcraft and magic in the 19th century, and how it seems to be different to other counties. Not all counties, but some other counties. And I'll talk about the research on the other counties and open up for questions. I don't have full answers for why, as we'll see, Somerset is extremely rich in witchcraft accusations and in the activities of cunning-folk who, amongst other things, which I'll talk about, dealt with witchcraft and with suspected witches. So three parts there. So let's start off then. Folklore sources. So, how do you research 19th century witchcraft and witchcraft accusations, cunning folk, and the broader, say, social world of magic? Well, obviously, folklore itself is really important, and Somerset is very rich compared to some other counties. In fact, Somerset and Devon are some of the two richest counties we have when it comes to 19th century and early 20th century folklore sources. And I'm talking about folklorists who are collecting material, and also people who are interested in popular beliefs and customs who are kind of collating information. And it's also rich, as Steve alluded to, in novels which include witchcraft and magic. I'm just looking up. Can I grab it? I'll just go and grab it. Hold on. So, for example, we have The Witch Ladder by E.S. Tiley, and some of you might be familiar with this. There is a witch ladder in the Pitt Rivers Museum, which is the source of much discussion. But there are a number of novels like that, like The Witch Ladder, which are based on witchcraft accusations. And that one is even more intriguing because it actually includes a petty sessions trial involving witchcraft within it. And Walter Raymond, who was a well-known folklorist and regional novelist, often compared with Thomas Hardy in the 1880s and 1890s, now largely forgotten, but he too would scour the countryside of Somerset looking for examples of popular customs and traditions. He wrote these down in various series of semi-fictional accounts, one of which included meeting, very moving, one of the most moving accounts I've come across with someone who had been accused of witchcraft in the 19th century as she tended her goat all alone and opened up to Walter Raymond. It's a very moving account, a real insight there. So it's rich in that source of material, and that's fantastic. And actually, quite a lot of this material, as I say, was being collated rather than collected. And that's because it also had a very strong, what you might call expat community in London. And in the early 20th century, they actually set up the Society of Somerset Men in London, which did include women. But, the societies in those days were obviously male orientated. And they produced what was known as the Somerset Yearbook, which became this sort of focus for reminiscences and artistic reflections on how wonderful Somerset was. Some of it is really quite ludicrous in its rose-tinted view of the county. You get some of the most painful sorts of poems about how beautiful Somerset is. Now, I like Somerset, and it is fantastic, diverse and rich county. But as I say, there was this kind of romanticized folkloric view, which included witches in that scope. But as we shall see when it comes to looking at the cases of witchcraft and assault, this is a really serious and terrible matter in the 19th century. There are lots of mostly women who are being abused, having to leave their homes, having to leave their villages, being scratched, being verbally attacked. It's nasty, nasty stuff. And it goes on in Somerset into the early 20th century. And we know that from the court cases. So what the folklore doesn't give you is the actual information on the individuals concerned in these disputes, particularly when it comes to things like assaults. They talk about people, they interview, they don't give you their full names, they might tell you where they live. So what you can't do with most of the folklore sources is what's known as record linkage. In other words, you identify the person, you can go to censuses, you go to parochial records and find out more about who these individuals were. Folklore very rarely gives you that information. It's a bit easier with cunning-folk because they often did name them and told you where they came from. So that's a bit more easy. So if you're going to research witchcraft and witchcraft accusations in the 19th century, whether in Somerset or anywhere else, what you need to do is you need to go to the newspapers or to the criminal records, because those are the ones which are going to give you names, places, often ages, the data for which you can then go and explore further the lives of these people and their relationships to others in their community. You can see, for example, how many doors down the person who was making the accusation was from the supposed witch, and vice versa. So you can start doing a kind of a social geography of a community in relationship to these accusations and the subsequent trials that take place here. You may ask, why don't you just go straight to the criminal records? Well, unfortunately, that's really not easy. That's so much more time consuming. Most of these cases of petty assault, I say the psychological and damage that we have to comprehend when we're talking about these accusations and what those being accused felt, we should no way diminish, but they were brought before minor courts, the petty sessions in most cases. There are a few cases of the quarter sessions, which was a bench of magistrates who oversaw, in a sense, a trial. And then there are just a couple of cases of serious offences, which were brought before the senior court, the assize courts, which dealt with capital trials, for example. And Somerset has a very, well, not actually a very little known case, but in 1916, there was an assize trial over a farmer who shot dead his neighbour in Somerset over a witchcraft dispute. Those are very, very rare. Most of these cases of assault and abuse on suspected witches, and also the prosecution of cunning-folk for fraudulent pretences, were before petty sessions. And petty sessions weren't a court of records. Again, they were held in the second half of the 19th century in police courts. But most of those records don't survive. So trying to attempt to reconstruct this dynamics about witchcraft and magic is very difficult if you're only going to go to the criminal records first. The newspapers are the key, because the newspapers cover all of the petty sessions trials across the county, as well as the court of sessions and the assizes. And it's the newspapers and their reports, particularly from the second half of the 19th century onwards, which are so rich in material about witchcraft and magic in this period. And the petty sessions themselves, obviously the newspapers always looking for tidbits that are sort of, interesting to readers. And so a petty sessions trial in Crooken or in Marnell or in Yeovil will be picked up if it involves witchcraft and magic. So I was pretty convinced after doing this research that I was picking up pretty much all of the cases, court cases involving witchcraft and magic. That we're talking about in terms of accusations and abuse of witches. I found in the 19th century, 26 court cases. And then if you go to the early 20th century, there's another handful of those as well. So we have roughly over 30 court cases, all of which you can do record linkage because there's enough detail on the people. When it comes to cunning folk, fortune tellers, diviners, astrologers, I've got over 50 court cases in the 19th century involving those characters. And I'll focus down on cunning folk a bit later on this. I did a lot of that research before the days of digitization. So I spent many, many days and weeks in the old Somerset archives, which at the time were housed in the castle in Taunton. Just ploughing through week by week of Somerset newspapers on microfilm, which is really tough on the eyes for those of you who've done microfilm research, but that was the only way of doing it. There was no digitization in newspapers in the 1990s. So I systematically went through the Somerset County Herald, which was the most principal, had the best coverage I had identified, best coverage across the county. And I went through every single week, the weekly newspaper through the whole of the century. In fine comb, looking at everything, because the newspapers not only report on court cases, they also report bits of folklore information as well, just like the folklorists were doing. And they often reported talks by the folklorists, such as Walter Raymond, and they would then report on what Walter Raymond had said in his talk to whatever the Taunton Society or whatever it happened to be. And so there's lots more than just the court cases in newspapers of interest to anyone interested in witchcraft magic at this period in the country. And then what I would do is then follow up. So I'd take the court data, then I would go to other local newspapers, burgeoning from the 1860s onwards in the county. So I'd follow up in other newspapers, which often had more detail than the Somerset County Herald did. And so there you accumulate a really rich body of material, which I say you can then do record linkage and go to the censuses and other records. When digitization of newspapers really started kicking in the late 2000s, into 2010, 15, that sort of period, I did go back and look at the digitized newspapers to see, had I missed much from my fine comb research using microfilm? And I was pleased to say I didn't actually. In one sense, for this is interest for those of you who are research historians out there, what it did confirm was that the old-fashioned way was more meticulous than doing the digitized searches today. And that's all due to the underlying metadata in digitization, where words are misspelled, particularly something like witch. You can imagine typing in witch and you get witch, WH, for example. And it can get very knotty and confusing. So actually the old school way was really good, but there is huge value obviously in the digitization as well. And I did pick up a few more cases and instances that I hadn't picked up on, but then the digitization hadn't picked up on a lot of the stuff that I picked up on. So interesting there, and the shifting nature of research practice in this period. So let's move on to talk about what we found out from these trials then. Okay, so we'll focus first on witches and witchcraft accusations. Most of these trials, as I say, were about abuse and assault of mostly women, and I'll talk about percentages and a bit of data in a moment. A number of these, quite a few of them, were based on scratching. So it's a physical assault. Some is about verbal abuse, just continual and basically harassment. But a number of them, a significant number, are also scratching. In other words, a person has gone up and deliberately drawn blood from a person, often on the face, not always, it could be on the back or whatever. There's a notorious case from just neighbouring Dorset in the 1860s where a farmer beat a 80-year-old woman so severely that she nearly died, and she had lacerations all down her back. And I've just been doing some research on asylum records for Devon, a Devon County asylum, and there was another woman who was brought to the asylum with multiple scars, elderly woman with multiple scars down her back after locals had beaten to scratch her and draw blood and basically make hell of her life to force her out. So it's quite severe injuries sometimes. But in most cases, it's I wouldn't say it's a light scratch, but the intent is to draw blood. And the reason for drawing blood is to break the spell. This is a very powerful form, which you see back in 17th century English witch trials as well. It's a long-standing, popular counter-witchcraft measure. And it's the assault to perform magic, which ends up in court. Obviously, the courts are only dealing with it as an assault, but the assault is more than just that. It is a performance of magic in its own right as well. So abuse, general just beating someone up, but also then ritualized harm, ritualized counter magic, which is leading to these assault cases. And we can perhaps think of these cases, and they have been called this. I've called them this, and a famous Danish folklorist has called them this: reverse witch trials. They're witch trials in reverse. And what we mean by that is that obviously the Witchcraft Act of 1736 had basically decriminalised the whole concept of witchcraft. Witchcraft from 1736 legally was considered a fraudulent pretence, just as cunning-folk were also considered as fraudulent. No one could really perform magic, and it would not be recognised in the courts. So what we have with these 19th century trials are witch trials in reverse, where it's the suspected or accused witch who is the prosecutor, and it's the person making the accusations or the persons who have committed the assaults who are the defendants. So it's a reversal of the pre-1736 witch trials in that dynamic courtroom dynamic. These are trials which are brought by those accused and abused of being witches in Somerset and everywhere else. Some data then on who are the accused? Who are the accused out of these 26 cases, which actually, when I mapped on the handful of cases from the early 20th century, didn't make any difference to the statistics. So first and foremost, who are these suspected accused witches who are so brutally dealt with? They are 96% of them women. 96% of them are women, which is not far off, the data you get for the early modern witch trials. That's over 85%. So it's not that much different. So between the 16th and 17th centuries in the witch trials and 19th century, the whole nature of the gendered nature of witchcraft doesn't change. It's nearly always women who are receiving this. There's always a few men as well. I know if they say there's one or two men. If I look at the folklore records, you find more men being accused of witchcraft than you do in the court cases, and you can think perhaps about the nature of gendered violence as part of that. Is a suspected male witch less likely to be assaulted than a female accused witch in the 19th century? So you can start picking and using out what this means. So 96% women. They're nearly all what you might call of the labouring classes in the 19th century. And a third, this is interesting, we'll unpick it a bit again, a third of those accused were widows. Okay. Now, you can try and explain, I think it's probably a mix of them. One, is it because the widow was part of that kind of social stereotyping of what a witch should be in a stereotypical way. In other words, widows, marginal, on their own, perhaps doing a bit of begging to make ends do, makeshift economy. Is it that? Is it about the stereotyping and the social position? Or is it just that actually they're widows because women tend to be accused of witchcraft or identified with witchcraft in their middle ages and later life? So in other words, is it the fact of their age and are more likely to be widowed, or is it the fact that they're widowed? I suspect there's the two of those are at play at the same time. What's going on here? Now, actually, I shall switch and just show you there's just a few examples of what these reports often look like in the newspapers. It's often witchcraft tragedy, often with the headline superstition in Somerset. Witchcraft is generally, these cases are denounced and sort of shake of the head by the editors of another case of superstition in the county. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. We talk about newspaper reporting in our final section because that's relevant there about biases. I just want to show you the frequency, if you can see that frequency. In other words, the timeline of these trials, which is interesting. If you can see that, you'll see there's a small crop of court cases, 1810s, 1830s, a bit of a gap in nothing in 1840, and then the peaks there are 1860 and 1870, and then starts reducing from 1880 onwards. And we were only dealing with a small amount of data here, so it's, in one sense this is not profound, but we do need to explain and understand what's going on here. And essentially two things explain this. I don't think this mirrors necessarily some sort of increase of witchcraft accusations and witchcraft abuse in the 1860s and 1870s. I think that there's a baseline of that going on. This is about two things, I think. One is reporting, newspapers. Pre-1840, there are a lot fewer newspapers and there's a lot less local and regional coverage in Somerset as there is in other counties. The boom in regional and local newspapers, particularly local newspapers, took place in the 1840s onwards. So I suspect this is about reflecting the increase in reportage at the ground level. We're picking up more cases because there's more coverage of the petty sessions taking place from the 1850s and 1860s onwards. So I think it's partly that. It's also partly because in the 1850s, we have the rise of the new police force. And I suspect the new police force replacing the old constable system led to more prosecutions as well. You have to remember that in early 19th century Somerset and elsewhere, the constable was in a very tricky position. The constable was an unpaid position. He was part of the community. It's someone who had to be literate, someone who was property owning in one sense, normally a artisan, farmer, that sort of level, craftsperson. Not an easy job in a small community to be a constable, particularly when it comes to witchcraft accusations. Where do you lie? Where do your allegiances lie? Do your allegiances lie with you as a state official, as a royal official? Or, and perhaps, I'm sure a lot of constables did believe in witchcraft as well, do you kind of side with your community when they suspect a gang up on a suspected witch? Where do your loyalties lie? And we do see this happening in cases across the country where the constable kind of just steps back and goes, I'm not interfering here because that will ruin me and the community if I side with the suspected witch. Advent of the new police, uniformed, not necessarily the community. In fact, proactive policy to get people from outside the community to recruit them, put them in a uniform, put them in the community, creation of local police courts, more formalized, and perhaps those who were being abused and assaulted felt more confident about bringing court cases against the people who were abusing them. So two things going on there, I think, which explains that pattern. Okay. Another couple of graphs. I rarely do quantify. This is very small numbers, I know, but I rarely do quant data stuff. So I remember I've been quite pleased doing my little graphs here at the time. Anyway, here's a couple of compare and contrast graphs about those being abused as witches and those who are doing the abusing and scratching, for example. So look at the top graph there, and you will see that most of those accused of witchcraft, like I say, 96% of them women, most of them 40 and over. Okay, and the peak age really being 50 to 70. So that's interesting, and unpick a bit in the stereotype of the wizened, bent double, really aged, crone witch. Yes, it does exist, and stereotypes did lead to development of reputations for witchcraft. But as you can see here, the majority are in this kind of 40 to 70 bracket. And again, that does mirror data from the witch trials from the continent and from this country as well. And some early modern historians have looked at this date range as well, and I think the same explanations are probably valid for the 19th century in Somerset as well. In this date range, we are talking about women who are mostly beyond childbearing. And I think this is significant, because when you look at the second graph at the bottom there, that's the age of those doing the accusing and the assaulting. Okay? And 2/3 of those who physically assaulted and abused suspected witches, 2/3 were also women. So a lot of this, at least the front end of the violence, is women against women violence in 2/3 of the cases. And when you look at the age of those, you will see people are significantly younger. The witch scratchers are significantly younger than the people they are scratching. Mostly, as you can see, between 20 and 40. In other words, in the age bracket, who are likely to have children. So what you've got set up here is an interesting gender dynamic in accusations, where younger women are coming to suspect older women of being witches, and it's not always about bewitched children. In fact, that's quite a minority of the cases in these accusations. There are ones of you bewitched my child is ill, it's you, because you're jealous. You're jealous that you can't have children anymore, therefore you accuse it. So there's a kind of a dynamic, a psychological dynamic here, which is clearly playing out. As I say, you can see it echoes of it in past centuries as well. But it's also interesting in the sense that these younger women may be perhaps more likely to be doing work in fields where witchcraft accusations really get generated. I'm thinking here particularly in the case of Somerset, of dairying, the dairying industry. Because women in general, these are broad sort of statements here, but women in general were in charge of the dairy, processing of milk, of making butter, of making cheese. And this was a big area of accusations and suspicions of witchcraft. The cows don't give milk anymore. The butter's refusing to come. The cheese isn't doing it. The whey's gone off. It's sour. All these sort of accusations come out. And I suspect that a number of these, and you can see it in some of the actual accusations cases, is younger women in charge of dairying, parts of dairying in local scale dairying, and making accusations when things go wrong against these older women again. So it's more than just the idea of young women and old women and childbearing and non-childbearing. There's also these other dynamics about age-related and work. It's interesting when you do look at the very small scale and broader, just to go macro to England, you look at male on male accusations in the 19th century, they tend to nearly always be in the workplace. So it'll be ploughing. You get accusations of a horse going lame. So the man's in charge of ploughing will accuse the boy or the man in charge of grooming and looking after the plough horses, etc. So you do see these accusations playing out in workspaces, work environments, and particularly so, I think, in some of these aspects of gendered nature of accusations here. Okay, let's perhaps think about some of the other reasons why, examples of how these witchcraft accusations come about. So, as I say, dairying industry, domestic misfortune is part of it. And that can be in all sorts of ways. The bewitched pigs are often a source of witchcraft accusations. Pig is really important in a kind of a makeshift economy, a pauper economy. Fattening up a pig all year to have it slaughtered around Christmas time, providing you salty bacon for as much as the rest of the year. Really important. So if your pig then goes and dies, your one pig that you've nurtured, that's a big blow. It's a financial blow. It's also a bit of a psychological blow for a family, which is looking forward to it. So people are more or less going to be willing to go and assault and abuse a suspected witch, depending on the seriousness of the misfortune that they've experienced on this. Very few cases of, oh, my chickens stopped laying, will end up in an abuse or assault. It'll end up in people suspecting witchcraft that the chicken's not laying, but they're not going to risk a court appearance. They know that when they go and when those younger women go and assault and scratch those older women, they know that they're probably going to go to court, particularly from the 1850s onwards. So there's a calculation going on here about what risk am I going to take as the accuser on this? Am I just going to let it lie? Am I going to go off to a cunning folk? Or am I going to physically attack suspected witch? Lots of decision making takes place here before the actual act is done. And it's normally about the seriousness, economic seriousness, or perhaps the psychological seriousness of the suspected misfortune and bewitchment. There's a subset within this, which is really interesting, which I've written a separate paper a long time ago, which is about hag riding, or sleep paralysis, as you might know it, or the nightmare in its strictest terms. And hag riding, we know, is a condition that people, roughly 15 to 20% in this country, still suffer from today. It's that experience when you're sleeping, and it's to do with waking up in REM or non-REM episodes of sleep. And sleep paralysis occurs, as I say, I've had it once in my life, but some people suffer from multiple attacks of sleep paralysis at night. And this was happening in 19th century Somerset. We know it from the court cases because they tell you of the exact experience. I woke up at night, I was paralyzed, I could not move, and I could barely breathe. My chest was being crushed. There was a crushing weight on my chest. And I saw the witch. I saw her come and sit on me, on my chest, or in my room. But sometimes they'll actually say, I saw the witch come and sit on my chest. I could barely breathe. And then she left, and you're left sweating. So this is a real physiological condition, sleep paralysis. It's when the episodes of rapid eye movement sleep, when essentially your central nervous system is going bonkers. That's why your eyes are constantly doing that. But your muscles are completely relaxed. So this is the moment where your muscles get a rest. But if that gets interrupted, your central nervous system is going mad. You can start hallucinating, all sorts of hallucinations, but you can't move because your muscles haven't opened up yet. So that's where it all comes from. I've seen about 5 or 6 of these cases are based purely on people experiencing this and seeing who they then subsequently accuse and abuse on them, sitting on. One example of this hag riding is in 1852. It's a court case from Crooken. And elderly lady, Charity Furzer, lovely name, Charity Furzer, is accused by her own niece of being a witch. And her niece says, her niece is named Grace Webb, night after night, my aunt comes and sits on my chest. She agonizing pain. She rides me. She hag rides me. I can't take it anymore. I'm not getting any sleep. I can't work. It's driving me insane. So I then went, she's a witch. I had to do something about it. I went and scratched her. And it's quite a moving case from what we know, because then in the subsequent court case where Charity Furzer prosecutes her niece, she almost fears that she is the one in the dock. And she says to the magistrate with tears in her eyes, pouring down her eyes, I'm not a witch. I'm not a witch. So very moving. It shows you the strength of belief on both sides here. And the very fact that in the 1860s, 1870s, those accused who are actually prosecuting their accusers feel they have to justify that they are not witches. So they say you can imagine a very, very serious and a terrible, unpleasant experience for all involved in those experiences. Okay, let's move on to cunning folk then. As I say, I picked up 50 or 60 court cases and prosecutions of fortune tellers, astrologers, and cunning folk. I'm not going to focus, I haven't got time to do fortune tellers and astrologers. I'm going to focus on cunning folk because they are central to witchcraft accusations. Because those 26 cases, those 26 court cases of witchcraft, they are a tip of the iceberg. Just as witch trials were, the tip of the iceberg of the number of accusations going on. That's where the folklore is really valuable. The folklore shows us that these accusations are happening up and down the county all the time, every week. But most of them, vast majority, never end up in court. Vast majority of them never end up in an abuse or assault. They're just suspicions that rankle, and you say, "Oh, damned woman down the road. She's done it to me again," but you don't do anything about it. So the court cases are tied to the other. So if you're the majority of cases, how do you deal with witches? You trot yourself off to a cunning person, a wise woman, a wizard. And they are central to this whole world of dealing with witches and identifying witches and countering witches without actually physically encountering the suspected witch. So they're absolutely central to this whole network of belief. And here's a couple of we rarely have images of 19th century cunning folk, very rare. But Somerset is lucky because the one on my left, the colour one, is a famous Taunton cunning man, Billy Brewer. Billy Brewer died in the 1890s. As you can see, he's a rather eccentric chap who's clearly wearing a wig. And he was we know from a couple of court cases, because he ended up being prosecuted, and from some ethnographic data, that he really was a rather strange man. And we have there's reports from where he lived in Taunton, where the kids used to taunt him. So although he was feared and respected across the county, he was also a bit of a figure of fun with 6-year-old kids, dealing with people who don't seem strange to them. So a highly remarkable character and slightly eccentric character in the community. The one on the right is just an example, is actually from neighbouring Devon. As we shall see, Somerset people would travel outside the county, not bound by the county, and they would go and visit well-known and well-reputed Devon cunning and Dorset cunning folk as well. The guy on the right, say, dresses more normally, not an agricultural labourer. We don't know who he was, probably a small farmer. And most of them did not dress, except some did, like Billy Brewer, but others just dressed normally. You wouldn't know they were sort of supposedly possessed with magical powers at all. So I'm just giving you to show the normality of this as well, and these rare images we have photographed of cunning folk from the period. Cunning folk, again, if we look at the data from the accusations, from the trials, from having done all the record linkage behind all these people, work on the censuses, etc., 2/3 of cunning folk were male, and again, you see that from the 17th, 16th century right through to the 19th century as well. Not much change, just like the gender dynamic. 2/3 of them are male. Nearly all of them are literate. They're from the artisan, trades, crafts, small farmer strata of society. Very few cunning folk were labourers. You have to think about, how do you develop a magical reputation? Why would people come and pay you money to go and deal with witches, with love magic, with detecting thieves, with retrieving stolen property? One, you need to kind of make a show that you're literate, read books, and you have possession of books. You need to be established yourself. Generally, a lot of them had their own consulting rooms, for example, which are decked out in certain ways, often sometimes with scrying services and things like that. So there's a certain social level to building reputation. Say 40% of them were women, and one of the most famous and well-known in Somerset was Mother Hearn, or Mrs. Wills, which I managed to research and find in the censuses. And indeed, you can see her cottage on the 1880 Ordnance Survey map, although you can't see it anymore. It was demolished in 1920. Although back in the 1990s, you could still see a patch of ground where Mother Hearn's cottage. And that was quite impressive in one sense, because probably thousands of people over the career of Mother Hearn, which they lived about a mile north from Charlton Hawthorne, if you're from the south of Somerset. Thousands of people trekked many miles to see Mother Hearn, and to that little cottage, which no longer exists. And you can stand there and kind of try to imagine these carts coming up with people who were lame, people with triangles, people who thought they were bewitched, people coming for herbal remedies. She was renowned for her herbal remedies, for example. And it moves us on to distribution, because this is quite interesting. Important point which this research raised, which probably wasn't quite so clear beforehand, was the distances people did not just go to their local cunning person. A lot of the decision making is on reputation. That's the one for me. I've heard they're doing that. So and so from the village said they were cured of witchcraft by that one. I will go there. I will take the expense of a 20-mile, 30-mile journey. So here you can see all the dots. All the dots are the cunning folk I've identified operating through the 19th century. Obviously, not necessarily all at the same time. But that's the totality of the ones I've managed to identify and then locate. The arrows indicate the distances that people would travel, and then also the distances that cunning folk would travel out to see clients. So it works both ways. some of the most popular ones, like Billy Brewer, would travel all over the place. And obviously, with the rise of the railways across Somerset, it made it a lot easier for cunning folk to go around doing their magical practices, which is an interesting way of showing how technology and supposed advancement actually helped spread access to popular magic at this time. The clusters you see with a circle around them, which obviously are usually market towns, where you get multiple numbers of cunning folk. And you can see there, if you can identify where Taunton is, Taunton was pretty not infested with them. There's only four of them, but a key place. A lot of people from both Devon and Somerset would trek their way to Taunton, often say up to 20 to 30 miles they would travel to get to the right cunning person like Billy Brewer. And part of that is you have to think about the economics of popular magic here, because these cunning folk, whether they're men or women, are smart people. They're smart and devious often, and unscrupulous often. Not all of them, but a lot of them are quite unscrupulous. And they work out, how do they attract clients? How do they make a living out of this? And one of the fact that they're willing to travel to their clients is one benefit. You're more likely to call someone in who is willing to travel, like Billy Brewer. But other ones, like James Stacey, for example, who was at South Petherton, generally stayed put. But Taunton's interesting because you can see concentrations where there are market towns and where there are markets, because market day is a key day when farmers in particular come in and take advantage of going to see the cunning person, as well as dealing with their various other agricultural matters at the market. And we see this in accusations, we see it in ethnography and folklore as well, that market day was a top day for cunning folk. They would sometimes come to have their own premises, but sometimes they would also be in a pub, and everyone knew which pub to go and have a consultation, for example, with the cunning man on market day. So again, interesting dynamics there about the ways in which cunning folk are spread across. You'll see there's a lot of it there is in the central south part, as well as Bath at the top there, but the central south part. Fewer cunning folk in the far west there, and obviously, and also down in the levels. And I suspect this is partly to do, and again, you could do a lot more work on this, which I haven't done, looking at population densities. Is it due to the fact that a lot of these cunning folk are in more predominantly dairying areas of the county? That's where they're most likely to get a livelihood. People are most willing to, there's more people. So there's interesting ways you could take this research further on Somerset, let alone doing it for other counties. Which would be fascinating. Because I have to say, no one else has really done this level of county surveying since, really. This is some really interesting work going on, PhD research taking place about researching 19th century newspapers. Julie Phillips is doing some really interesting stuff with Ronald Hutton, for example. So there's good work going on, but this kind of granular county record linkage stuff is rarely done. So cunning folk are essential to this, and this takes us to kind of the final section now. I don't think I've got a slide. No, that's the end of the slides. I'll leave it on county. So all this richness, all these court cases, all this folklore ethnographic tour of Somerset. So I thought years ago, let's try and test this out in a comparative way. And I did a study back in the early 2000s then. I got some money to do a study on Hertfordshire, County of Hertfordshire, the university I'm at. And we got some money and we paid someone to spend 6 months doing just what I did, combing through the microfilm. Digitization still hadn't happened yet. Combing through the microfilm of all the major Hertfordshire newspapers to see if we can pick up these court cases involving cunning folk and witchcraft accusations. So after 6 months, what did we find? Nothing. Not one case, not one court case involving witchcraft and magic. Cases involving herbalists, things like that. There was one mention of one cunning person in newspapers for the whole of the 19th century. So I thought this is fascinating. What's happening? Somerset. You could say that Somerset and Hertfordshire are not dissimilar in the sense that they're very roughly speaking counties of small towns. Obviously, different economies we'll talk about in a moment, but they're roughly small town counties. Hertfordshire is much more rural in the 19th century than most people think. Yes. Suburbanising North London is encroaching into Hertfordshire and having an effect, but the north part of the county, very rural, right through until the 20th century, really. And obviously Taunton had its own. Taunton wasn't purely rural. Somerset had a coal industry in the Mendips. It also had a big gloving industry in the south as well. So it's not just all about agriculture. So why is this happening? Anyway, I thought this was fascinating. So I put in another grant application, which was based on the fact that we hadn't found anything in Hertfordshire, and said, isn't this wonderful, to the funding body? And they said, no, it isn't. You're just giving you money. You haven't found anything. But no, we have. The absence of evidence here is going on. But people don't give you money for that sort of thing, unfortunately. Anyway, so I kind of let it drop. Then a few years later, I got another opportunity in another grant project, which was looking at enclosure, process of enclosure in Northamptonshire. So as part of this project, big project, I got someone to do exactly the same newspaper research again for the county of Northamptonshire. County obviously going under quite a lot of agricultural county, undergoing obviously a lot of physical and social change because of enclosure itself through the late 18th and early 19th centuries. My role in this was to look at the ways in which enclosure impacted on social dynamics, which could have led to accusations and also the transmission and continuation of folkloric beliefs, which is still a really interesting task, kind of ongoing. But anyway, newspaper research. Zilch, once again, practically zilch, practically no mention of cunning-folk, not one trial, not one case of assault or suspected witches or abuse of. So, 2 counties, one in the Midlands, one in the home counties, and Somerset. 2 other ones, nothing. Absolutely rich in Somerset. We know Devon is rich, plenty of court cases in Devon. Yorkshire, I know from work I've done over the years, fairly rich. There's cases, and there are cases and court cases dotted out. I've identified, 80 or 90 a long time ago, and I'm sure that number has risen with more recent research by others. And Thomas Waters is another one who's been doing some interesting research here, and newspaper research using digitized resources now, obviously. So, but we're still left. This is where we end, in a sense. We're still left with this conundrum then, which I'm still kind of unpicking every now and again, as to why there are so many court cases in Somerset, say Devon, but compared to Northampton or Hertfordshire, or you could say the same of Surrey or Suffolk. Sussex. Yeah, you get some. There are a number of court cases in East Anglia. It's interesting. So there is a geography here. And Somerset is a hotspot. So, what's it all about? My hunch, and again, we need to do more work. My hunch is this is the richness here and the intensity, which shows the intensity of the belief, in which is the fact that people are willing to abuse and assault and risk going to court, shows you something about financial risk, the psychological risk that people are putting onto misfortune and witchcraft explanations for this. Perhaps tells us something about the daring. I think a lot of this and the richness is about the daring and the intensity of belief in the 19th century continuing of daring way of life. Because I'll say a lot of these accusations are focused and centered on farming, but in particular, dairy farming. You find very few accusations involving arable farming. You can go on the continent and you'll see examples of crop damage being blamed on witches, etc., in the witch trials. You don't find it in the early modern period in this country, hardly at all. And in the 19th century, I've not come across one case which involves accusations of witches destroying crops, whether it's wheat, barley, or vegetable crops, or whatever. So I suspect in a strongly daring place like Somerset, Devon, it's the daring that's doing it. In other words, the multiplicity of ways in which misfortune can happen and how they can be linked to an individual, the witch. As I say, the cheese, the butter, the milk, the cows drying up. And so that's where my hunch lies at the moment, that this is explicable, that. And that explains how prolific and important cunning-folk were, because there's so much work to do in a dairying community like this. You've got your background of accusations which are about neighbourly disputes, usual stuff, which today, the hedge growing too high, barbecue smells, all that sort of petty stuff ends up in witchcraft accusations in the 19th century context. So there's a baseline. And then around that, you've got all this dairying stuff going on, all the stuff about bewitchment of cows and obviously the cattle industry as well, which is mixed up with the dairying industry in the county. And so that's where I am at the moment on this puzzle of why Somerset is so full of witch abusers, cunning folk, and I'll leave it there.
Okay, thanks, Owen. That's fab. So we've got some questions coming in already, and so we'll start cracking on with them, I think. And I have this hunch there's going to be an awful lot of questions, as I said before. So try and keep your answers short, and we'll get through as many of them as we can. So the first one I've got here is from Richard, who's actually asking. You have sort of described what cunning folk are, I suppose, but he was asking for a definition, really, and whether you can sort of come up with other group distinctions in the same field. We talk about cunning folk. What else?
I mean, these things aren't hard and fast, but I define cunning folk. They call different terms. Billy Brewer was called the Wizard of the West. James Stacey in South Petherton was called the Wizard of South Petherton. Probably lots of people knew James Stacey as the Wizard rather than knowing his actual name. You just went to see the Wizard of South Petherton. And wise woman, wise man, conjurer is quite common here. So I just use cunning folk as the overall kind of title for these people. And
cunning folk then. They're always people you go to undo witchcraft, rather than so they don't ever pop their copybooks by saying, by people who haven't paid them properly, they can't then turn spells themselves, or can they?
Oh yeah, no, I mean cunning folk are considered able to do anything, really, apart from raising the dead. Even then, no one's going to try and offer. But otherwise, it's myriad. But no, I mean, if you look at cunning folk in the early modern period of modern period, they're very wary about suggesting that somehow they're cursing people or not, or even offering that service, unless it's another witch. In other words, once you start as a cunning person saying, I actually, come to me and I'll bewitch that person you really hate, that's a really slippery slope. If a person says, "Come to me, I think I'm bewitched," fine. If it's just I can't stand that woman who I work next with, but then no, you've got to be really careful there, because that's when you start becoming the target of witchcraft acts. Because people, these are ambivalent characters. People know that. People know that these cunning folk do bad as well as harm. It's just
okay.
Their good services outweigh it, completely. And a few of them do get accused. I mean, this is the whole debate in early modern witch trials. Yes, a few cunning folk do get accused. But it's always, as you point out there, Steve, it's normally the client relationship where they think, hold on, I've just paid you 10 shillings for a cure. I'm not better. Are you keeping the spell on me? And then want more money from me. So you do get those. And as I say, some of them are downright, shysters.
I think you've got that problem quite often, because the one thing that's going to be a problem for cunning folk is that they are bound to fail.
Yeah,
because they can't do what they claim they can.
No, but I mean, we get a rich insight into diversity from when Billy Brewer died. A local newspaper rummaged around and found a lot of the letters that were being written to him from clients, and they published some of them, and it's fascinating. A lot of it, there's witchcraft there, but there's one of my favourites is someone who writes to him, goes in quite poor English, and goes, my clothes have come out all yellow again. Can you do something about it?
That's pants left in wash, isn't it?
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
Yeah. Okay, sorry. Let's crack on. There's a question here about your sources, actually, and people often say, very well if you're going to rely upon newspapers, but newspapers tend to sensationalise. So how do you kind of mediate the language of the newspaper press and sort of spot that which is clearly embellished or exaggerated?
Yeah, no, I mean, there is when you get into the early 20th century with local newspapers, there tends to be a bit more of an artistic, journalistic flourish in things. It's fascinating seeing the soberness of 19th century newspapers compared to newspapers today.
Oh yes,
they really are. It is news. They are newspapers. They are not opinion papers, as so many newspapers are today. That starts coming in a bit more. What's really interesting here, which just tying what I was my final section there, is how much of this maybe is reporting bias? Is it the fact that Hertfordshire newspapers or Northamptonshire newspapers just aren't reporting this? And it's a valid point. I would have to go through all the possible court sessions and the really poor survival of of police court records to get anywhere, and I don't think I'll be able to do it. It can only really be done through the newspapers as a surviving documentation. But some newspapers clearly were reluctant. When it comes to local and regional, some of them clearly are reluctant. I've seen this elsewhere. They're reluctant to report on this stuff because it looks bad for their community. We don't want to be reporting that there's been another case of witch abuse in Crooken or whatever, because that'll get in the national press, as it always does. And then they'll think we're all backward. And Somerset at this time has got enough on its plate with people thinking they're all yokels and backward, without saying, "Oh God, look at those damn witch believers! I can't believe." And this happens in the 1920s. There's a number of reports going. We drove down to Somerset and we saw all these superstitious people with these witch balls in their windows and things like that, and it's a dark sort of place down there. So some of the newspaper editors say we don't want to project that, and obviously will not report this stuff.
Yeah. And you did talk about, obviously at the end, you talked about comparative research in other counties. And I think you more or less said there hasn't been a great deal, but there's a specific question here about has anyone looked at Surrey?
I have done. If you do, you can try. I've done some searches for other counties now. Since digitisation, you type in the keywords and see what comes up. Surrey is one of those areas, and I used to live in Surrey. I did do some research there at one point. There are very few, very little. Now, if you go to rural Surrey, when I've lived in rural part of Surrey, it's deep rural. The Greensand Hills down there, down into the Weald, it's deep rural. But very little evidence, very little folklore. Again, it's one of those counties with hardly any real folklore. I mean, it doesn't exist, but it was not recorded. A guy called Edward Lovett, who's well known for writing a book called Magic in London, lived in Croydon, and he's one of the few folklorists to go delving into the Surrey Hills. And he found bits and pieces, but you get very little compared to the richness elsewhere. So but there's always more granular work to be done on Surrey, and these counties have very little. You really do find. But again, I think you can do the searches in the digitised press, but there are benefits for just doing that grinding trawl through, through the actual newspapers.
So our message to anyone in Surrey who wants to find out, please go start doing the work and then let me know what you discover. This is a great Somerset question. It's about whether or not you get any sense from the court records of alcohol sort of fueling some of these attacks on women. And I said this is basically because of the popularity of your cider in Somerset. Does it ever come up in evidence? Not really in the Somerset material, but if you do the broader work I've done on this in the 19th century, alcohol is there. Where it's particularly obvious is when you get witch mobbing, when you get a gang or group, people or a whole village ganging up. I should say there's only one example of collective action against a witch in 19th century Somerset, so it's unusual, and that was in 1867 in Somerton, where a woman called Elizabeth Gillett was accused by another younger woman again, and she put the word around that if we go into her house, we'll find her frying toads. As a spell, and so they did gang up, and dozens of them broke the door down, searched through the fireplace. Local PC just stood aside and had to be brought before the magistrates to say why weren't you protecting this woman, sort of thing. And you see in these mob actions, which you find elsewhere right through into the sort of 1850s, 1860s, elsewhere, you do see where alcohol fuels the kind of the Dutch courage. In other words, the gossip that takes place in a pub. Everyone piles out, they're going to get the witch. There's a very, very nasty case from Monmouth in 1827 in Monmouth, where exactly that happens. They all get tanked up and they all march out of the pub and they all march down to the old woman's house and they strip her naked and thrash her with strips of briar until she's nearly dead, to draw blood. And, a lot of that was fueled by alcohol. Yeah, inevitably, I guess. A question about the sort of rising numbers of women who were prepared to go to court and accuse people of scratching them or attacking them for witchcraft. Is that purely? What do you think? There's a case of women seeing other women getting justice and going, well, perhaps I will go to court. There must be. It's one of those things you're going to be reticent about going to court because obviously you attract you expose yourself further to the idea that you are indeed a witch. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good point. And it comes back to the fact that these court cases are only the tip of the iceberg of actual assaults and abuses. And we talked about the people who suspected they're being bewitched and their decision making. As you say, there's a hard decision making to be had if you're just being beaten up or repeatedly abused as a witch. What do you do? Do you just go, okay, I'm being ostracized, I'm just going to leave. I can't take this more, I'm going to leave. And this happens obviously around the world, country today for all sorts of reasons. You go, I can't stand it. People think I'm a witch. They're accusing me of witchcraft. I cannot live here. I'm moving. I don't care what happens. I should just move away. And we have examples of that where people just leave the parish and leave the community because they can't take it. They don't bring it to the authorities.
We know that's true of domestic violence too. Generally speaking, even today, but certainly in the 18th and 19th century, it's going before a magistrate to swear that your husband has been beating you isn't necessarily the first thing you want to think of doing. And it also has the danger of amplifying your reputation.
Yes. And that was undoubtedly a consideration because the news, everyone knows the news. They're reading. Most people are literate by this time. They are, a lot of them are reading or being read to newspapers. So they know this stuff, and you can see that by the fact that when cunning-folk get prosecuted in court, there's examples where they suddenly get lots of letters from more clients because they said, we read about you in the newspaper, sort of thing. Can you help me with this? So actually for a cunning person appearing in court is not necessarily a bad thing, but for someone who's accused of witchcraft, amplifying that in the press, it's a really difficult thing to do. And again, I come back to the poor old Charity Furzer sitting there with tears streaming down her eyes going, I'm not a witch to the magistrate. Let's get this straight, which is why I'm here. And clearly not convinced that she's being, she's still not being taken for a witch like she would have been 2 centuries ago. So it's tough. I mean, I say that being under that level of intense hatred and anger, being completely innocent. And I talked about the poor woman who interviewed by in a kind of semi-fictional way by Walter Raymond, who as he's tramping his way between glove factories, picking up piecework from glove makers. And he meets her, and she's just sitting there with a goat, and she says, "Oh, I'm going to open up to you," sort of thing, in a dialect. I'm not going to do a Somerset dialect, but she says, "You seem quite a nice person. I want to tell you something," sort of thing. And I've lived quietly and by myself now for years since they started telling those lies about me, and all I've got is my goat and my bees, and they keep me alive. That's all I live for. I just live for my goat and my bees. Because life otherwise is just so damn miserable. I've got no one to talk to, and I just want to talk to you. And I think it's, that I don't think that's an exceptional case. If you think about the hundreds of women who were in that position in the 19th century in Somerset alone, let alone across the country. And what do? She just shut down. She didn't move. She just isolated herself, which obviously in a sense also compounds the reputation. She keeps herself to herself,
Yeah. Okay. Question from Rachel, who's wondering, just know it's a specific question again. Any cases associated with chard that you know of?
Chard, yes. Gosh, I'd have to dig up my stuff but yeah, there is some chard. There is a cunning man in chard as well. I think it was his name, Cherry, something like that. He was, I think you can see it on the map down there, Chard. I think there's that one with the 2 spots.
No, I think that's probably why the question came up.
Yeah, there is. And he wasn't prosecuted, that one, but he appears in quite a few ethnographic folkloric references. So yeah, people did trek their way down to Chard to see him. I don't think I've come across any witchcraft accusations there. But obviously charged in that boundary area between Dorset, where to and fro goes on between there, and people might troop into some of the famous cunning folk from Dorset as well. So not necessarily picking up. So in one sense, the other thing you'd need to do in that sense is actually do the systematic newspaper surveying for Devon and Dorset to kind of pick up that kind of hinterland of activity around the county.
Yes. Okay. There's a question here about whether or not there are any cases where it was claimed that a witch was caught actually in the act of practicing magic, and does that come up in evidence?
People say they have. in most cases, it's not that sort of level of quality of evidence, put it that way. I caught her. So, I just mentioned the case where they all trooped in, bust the door down, expecting to find her frying toads, and she wasn't.
Right.
So there's a lot of I suspect, or I thought I saw something. A lot of that stuff goes on. Well, the accusation starts. So you're in the dairy, the butter isn't coming, and then your neighbour down the road comes walking by, says, "Oh, can I have a bit of butter or a bit of whey?" How did she come along at this moment? Well, my butter. Hold on, but my butter's not churning properly, and she's just turned up. Can't explain it. I think she's up to something. So the physical evidence is more along those lines, and people actually saying, "Yeah, I've caught her with playing with the toads, or drawing some symbol in the ground, or anything like that."
Yes. Okay. And there's a question here. You've sort of half answered this already, I think, but it's a specific question from Heather. Would like to know who was bringing court cases against cunning-folk and what for? It's presumably basically for failure to lack of success, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It's usually failures from the service that you've just stumped often pounds for on that basis, because it's you don't get collective actions against these people because they're too important, even if you don't like them. They're too valuable, particularly to say in the intensity of accusations and suspicions that are taking place. And this, so that they tend to be, I paid up a lot of money, I'm still ill, or my cows are still ill, I want my money back. Rarely do you get a sense that they don't believe they have magical powers. So
right.
Rarely do they sit in court going, I don't, he said he could do that. He said he could do that. I don't believe him. I think he's a fraud. It's more, I paid for this. He hasn't done his job properly.
Yes.
I want my money back. So it's very much that.
I guess you risked a certain amount of ridicule going into court and claiming that you'd been to see a cunning man who'd failed to produce the goods in the first place. Didn't you? I mean, it's a bit of a slightly risky.
Yeah, but then the thing is, you'd then go off after the court case. You'd then go off to another cunning person.
Yes, of course, yes,
and waste more money. But
yeah. Okay. There's a comment here from Ronald Hutton. So I'll read it out and then you can respond. He says, wonderful talk as usual. The counties rich in records of witchcraft belief in the 19th century tend also to be those with many trials in the 16th and 17th. So the enigma is a big one. Your dairying theory could fit both, but is Essex a dairying area?
Yeah, I know. Well, this is the problem. This is why I throw it out there, but not as an answer, because I've been kind of coming back to this one for a long time now. What it requires is just a big research project to really get granular and do the record linkage, and exactly that. Ronald knows Essex back to front on the folklore and stuff in 19th, 20th centuries on that county, and there are court cases. There are well-known cunning people, cunning moral, etc., operating there, and it would be fascinating to do, in a sense, a 19th century version of what Alan McFarlane did in 1971 by doing all that granular research in court records and record linkage that he did, and then applying it to the 19th century, and then seeing that, because a lot of the time, you're knowing and trying to understand an accusation in the context of a certain regional locality, which may have a very different agricultural basis to somewhere 15 miles away. It's one of the problems of talking at a county level, that unless you do that. But I was very aware when I was doing the Somerset study to look closely at the mining community, because I thought, okay, do we see things differently in the mining community? And obviously we don't get dairy accusations from most of them, unless there's dairying going on in the Mendips and sheep farming and everything else. But what I saw there, I looked at that, is I saw a lot of activity there in terms of communal shaming rituals, skimmingtons and stuff. That's taking place in Radstock and elsewhere. So there's clearly a strong community which is willing to act against people they think transgressed their communities. But less sense of witchcraft being a problem there. And I think it's this identifying different communities, whether it's in Essex, where witchcraft is still a problem, from other areas of the county where witchcraft is just less of a problem, less need for cunning folk. And I think you can only really do that by doing this really really granular level of record linkage, knowing the county, knowing really well the agricultural economic basis of these communities. And we did quite a lot of that. I worked with Nigel Goose, who's well-known census work, on the Hertfordshire stuff, so we did some crunching about the census data on different parts of Hertfordshire and their different economic bases. And we again tried to map it onto numerous skimmingtons. We found lots of rough music in Hertfordshire. That was the contrast. We found lots of rough music in Hertfordshire and no actions against witches. And so where does that leave you?
No, that's interesting. I know, and I also wonder whatever happened to urban witchcraft, because of the agricultural answer.
Well, I can update you on that, but not necessarily from a Somerset perspective. I imagine it'll be there because I've just finishing a big project which has been using thousands of cases from asylum records from the 19th century, particularly in the northwest of England. What that shows is a vibrancy of witchcraft accusations in Lancaster, Manchester, in the mill towns.
Oh, wow.
It's live and well right through into the 20th. Folklorists aren't going there, not picking it up. This stuff isn't ending up in trials, but it's there in people who are ending up in asylums because they're concerned and preoccupied with the fact they're being bewitched by their employers often. You get women on women accusations of domestic servants being accused in urban areas right through into the early 20th century. So that's really opened up my eyes again to these challenges of the sources and what they do or don't tell you.
And I'm sure you've already worked your way through Old Bailey online to see what's going on. Yeah. Just the kind of use of the language that you wouldn't get trials necessarily at the Old Bailey, but you would dimly find the language of belief. And
what it also is, you have to be careful because sometimes, particularly when people in somewhere, Somerset or in urban areas, wherever, when people find themselves in court, or one way or another, and have been accused of abusing a witch, they don't necessarily. Some of them are out and proud. She's a witch. I beat her up. I scratched her. I feel better. I don't care. I'll pay the 10 shillings. But some other people won't even use the word witchcraft. It's like, they've done something to me. Something's wrong. I think they're to blame. But you don't mention or accuse someone of being a witch or there's witchcraft. It festers. So there's a witchcraft without the language of witchcraft that takes place in the 19th century as well. I think you probably see that more in urban areas than you do in rural. But that could be playing out in Hertfordshire and Northamptonshire. It may be there. There aren't enough folklorists really picking stuff up, and the language is more coded. It's another possibility.
Yeah. Interesting question here from Ben. It says, I read quite an old now book on witchcraft and trials in Europe in the early modern period, which suggested witch-related violence increased each time there was a religious shift. So do you think religion plays any part in it? And obviously Britain has a lot of non-conformism, some of which was centred on this region, such as Methodism. Does that play a part?
Not as a direct link with people taking action against witches. I've written a couple of articles on Methodism and witchcraft in the 18th and 19th centuries. And there's a lot of accusations against the Methodists. And yes, get into the 19th century, Methodism becomes much more sober. Obviously, the primitive Methodists become quite popular in some areas, and they're very into providence and miracles and devils and demons and things. So, on a localized basis, they certainly might, in a sense, heighten fears of diabolic possession, but they generally don't focus much on. I mean, Wesley himself is very clear on this. He doesn't believe he believes in witchcraft, but his conception of witchcraft is very different from a labourer's conception of witchcraft. His is theological. His is almost like the demonological. His view of witches is essentially as those who are doing the devil's work, literally, and possessing people. It's not old man who bewitched my pigs. He has no time for that sort of stuff. That's just popular superstition to him. So you have to kind of unpick people's different definitions here. And again, the asylum records have been really revealing because they often give you the denomination of the person. And a lot of this belief doesn't matter whether you're Methodist, Unitarian, Catholic, Anglican. There's a kind of, I think it's kind of that baseline of a shared general set of supernatural religious beliefs that are shared. So I mean, there's really interesting things about ways in which witchcraft and Methodism were connected together. no sense that the growth of mythicism in the 18th century or primitive mythicism directly led to some sort of heightened sense there are witches everywhere.
No, right. No. You very quickly skated over the 1736 Witchcraft Act that basically sort of decriminalises witchcraft itself. But Heather would like to know exactly what the Act did say. How did it? What were its provisions?
Yeah, well, it's long and short of it. Long and short of it is that witchcraft, or anyone who says they can do witchcraft, is considered a fraud and a pretense. Now, the interesting thing with this, which people forget in relationship to the previous witchcraft and conjuration, so in other words, the 1563 Act, which kicked off really the witch trials in this country, and then the 1603 Act as well, both of those had provision in them for the prosecution of cunning-folk and accused witches. People tend to focus just on the witches, but in those acts, they were just as much targeting cunning-folk, these people who are considered to be, in a sense, doing the devil's work just as much as witches do. These white witches are just as bad as the bad witches. When it comes to 1736, and they say, actually, there's not any witches anymore, witchcraft is just a fraud and pretense. Anyone who says there's a witch now is fraud and pretense. Anyone who's a cunning person doesn't say, they don't use the term cunning person, but they basically, anyone who uses, pretends or offers for money to do anything which is magical, they too are frauds. So the 1736 is as much about, in a sense, decriminalising. In other words, the 1736 Act is as much about continuing to criminalise cunning folk as it is about decriminalising the idea of witches. I think that's probably the best way of putting it.
Yeah, no, that's really clear. A question from Chris Wilmore here. He says, to what extent might the differences be explicable by different judicial attitudes? So basically he's saying, I think if you're going to have some magistrates in petty session who have a reputation for needling out witches or acting against witches, or acting against people who scratch, so-called witches. And so if the courts give you short shrift, he says, you won't bother bringing cases, will you?
Yeah, I mean, this obviously, this shifts with the rise of police courts halfway through the century, in a sense, in rural areas. So it's a good point. It's a good point about the ways in which the criminal process works, just as it is fundamental to understanding how witchcraft trials take place in Britain in the early modern period. You've got to know the criminal justice system to really understand the nature of the trials and the pattern of the trials. Yeah, I mean, this it's very difficult to know, because obviously, certainly in the first half, second half, you can go to Yeovil Police Court. You step in and there's a uniformed police person. Blah, blah, blah. If you go to the earlier part, obviously you're more likely going to talk to the magistrate, the local magistrate, and obviously there, as in the past, long past, the decision making of the magistrate has big influence on whether anything goes forward. And so, yeah, I suspect, and you probably see this. I suspect you see this quite a lot, but we just don't know it in the 18th century. Post 1736, vast majority of the population still believes in witches. You've got people being killed by being swum by witches, but we have relatively few trials, and that could be all for all the sorts of reasons about reporting in no regional local newspapers. At the same time, it could also be that magistrates embarrassed by the concept of witchcraft. We don't want to be dealing with it as being, let's not talk about witchcraft anymore. Would have cases brought to him for decades afterwards by locals, no doubt about it. The hidden figure here of people trooping off to the magistrate saying, she's bewitched my pigs, do something about it.
Yes.
I'm sure there are thousands of examples of that taking place. We just don't know it because it's never recorded. So this is one of these grey areas again, where you have to use your imagination and think through the possibilities. I have no doubt about it, because even into the 1850s, people are going to their local clergyman and magistrate going, she's a witch. Why are you doing something about it? You're the law. She's a criminal. And so I suspect that it took decades for people not to go trooping, and I'm sure the magistrates will just said, no, just calm it down. You see that with some of the witch mobbings that take place in the 18th century and early 19th century. The magistrates it doesn't end up in arrests. The magistrates, it kind of reports say, the magistrates turned up, calmed the crowd, everyone went home. Let's not deal with this in the community. So yeah, I think that it's a good point, and it's just an unknown.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly.
the imagination of historians. That's what I like.
That's right. But these are all they're factors to sort of weigh up and think about, aren't they?
Yeah, exactly.
The sources are a bit opaque in the end. Interesting question here from Guy Davis, who says, is there something about dairying as being a magical activity in itself? The production of milk, the transition of milk into various other products, was that not considered inherently magical? I mean, in a sense, I guess, people didn't necessarily entirely understand the processes by which these things occur. And is there a little bit of magic in?
Yeah, no, it's nice. It's a nice point. And I have to say, I've not seen anything about people thinking like that. But at the same time, the point's good in the sense that why do you explain some misfortunes in terms of witchcraft and others not? Not everything gets explained in terms of witchcraft all the time.
Yes.
And obviously when it comes to making butter, it's an invisible process. And what's going on is an invisible process. And when the butter doesn't come, you can't see why it hasn't come. So, in one sense, that transformation that takes place in those forms, and the same thing happens. You get less so. You get accusations around beer going sour. Why is the beer gone sour? Some invisible thing has happened to make it sour. I've done everything right. Why has it happened? I mean, I did see. There's a kind of book of magic printed, very rare one. It wouldn't have been disseminated much, around 1824, and had various tips and things. And one of them was if you want to get back on someone with your neighbour. If you wanted to stop the butter from coming, you would slip a piece of soap into the churn, and that would stop it coming. So you can imagine that sometimes these things did happen by someone doing something malicious, but the actual process and then the explanation of misfortune becomes turned into a magical crime. Yes.
Okay. Here's an interesting thing. It's a comment really from Amber, but there is a sort of a question added to it. I coincidentally found mention of 2 people arrested for fortune telling in 1881, just yesterday in Bristol archives. Please will you come back and tell us more about fortune telling, or do you have any other talks coming up to talk about fortune telling?
Yeah, no, fascinating and not enough studied. I mean, I did a lot of work on fortune tellers in the First World War.
Why is fortune telling against the law?
Fortune tellers, because it comes under the Vagrancy Act, Section 4, which talks about subtle devices and palmistry. It explicitly mentions that palmistry for money is illegal, and then mentions these devices, subtle devices. So subtle devices can be any form of divination, for which money is being judged, or even magical. A lot of the cunning-folk are being prosecuted under Section 4 of the Vagrancy Act. They're not being prosecuted under the Witchcraft Act. People just don't want to touch it, of course. It happens occasionally, but magistrates are judges in the High Court, so much more likely to let's deal with this under Section 4 of the Vagrancy Act. So so fortune tellers, usually Section 4. Very occasionally, mediums are prosecuted under the Witchcraft Act as a fraudulent pretense, or under as fraudulent pretense. So Section 4. That's why. So you don't have to be a vagrant to be prosecuted under the Vagrancy Act. That's the key. It's the key thing here. And Section 4 is the key thing.
Okay. It's a question from Samuel. In cases where cunning folk were accused of witchcraft, have you found that any of the magic they were accused of using was represented in surviving print or manuscript grimoires, as Frank Clausen and Sharon Wright have done with accused magical treasure hunters in their recent publication, Magic of Rome?
Yeah. Frank Clausen's works have been doing some really interesting work on some of the early modern vernacular grimoires. Not in a 19th century context, really. In fact, there's very little reference to books of magic amongst the cunning folk. They clearly possess some, but it's not a high-profile thing amongst 19th century cunning folk at this period, anyway. The nearest interesting way in which you get to perhaps cunning folk, cunning person. Because obviously, people are going there. When someone says, "I'm bewitched," what does the cunning person do? Okay, first they divine the nature. Who is it? Confirm who's it. Sometimes the person just wants to know who it is, and the cunning person will do some divinatory ritual, real or otherwise, and say, "Oh," and they hardly ever name names. It'll just be some dark-haired woman, slightly stooped in your community. Thank you. And off you go. It's always in those couch terms. If you're being bewitched, you say, I suspect so and so. Kind of person goes, yeah, it's probably that. Yeah, I'll do a bit of my division. It's her. Okay, here's some charm. You want to do something about it, and so you get written charms, which sometimes are written out of manuscript books, but they don't exist. So written charms are used against witches, which are carried on yourself. In other words, they're protective. They're protective, or you put them around the farm. A particularly and distinctive form in Somerset, which I haven't talked about, just not enough time, would be the hearts up chimneys, pinned hearts up chimneys, which really I've analysed that really carefully recently in a book with Kerry Holbrook on building magic, and I've nailed exactly down to the region and when this practice of sticking hearts with pins and putting it in the fire took place, and it's around the 1850s. It's not some long. It doesn't seem to be some cunning person has kind of invented and brought together various familiar ideas of sticking pins in hearts and putting them at fires. But as an interesting case, some of those who've been to the Pitt Rivers Museum, where they have a heart pin from Somerset, that one was one of several which tumbled out of a pub chimney one night. And when you look at the evidence for that, what it actually looks like is they're cursing. In other words, these aren't about witches; it's actually cursing someone. So sometimes these rituals, which look as though they're, from a material perspective, look as though they're against witchcraft, are actually to cause harm to someone who isn't a witch. So it's quite complex. That's a slightly hazy, fuzzy answer. What I'd always like to get across is that cunning-folk is hugely inventive people, and they're all vying for each other in reputation. They all want to have their little signatures, USPs. And so you get a really quite rich diversity of anti-witch rituals and charms being provided, because they're trying to mark themselves out, right? Everyone's not some sort of generic, here's a generic block of folk magic that everyone's using. It's not like that.
Okay, we are all absolutely really out of time, but so I'll finish with one final question. I apologise to those of you who we haven't got to. There was just so many questions coming in. We'd have been here, or Owen would have been up all night answering. But this one's about the verdicts given in court for people who were taken to court for assault. So if you're taken to court for scrapping, how seriously do the courts tend to take it? Is it seen as, is it understood to be an important, serious form of assault, a scratching? Or not?
Again, it's all about the severity. So if you basically you're going to court because you went up and took a pin and went, and it's scratched, you will get away with fines. That's it. It'll be a few shillings. If you've taken a stick and beaten, an elderly woman to bleed, you will, and one person, certain Dorset farmer did, end up with 6 months in prison. So, in other words, you're quite right. The act itself may be the same, but the severity of the actual assault determines the degree to which, whether it's a petty sessions or it's an assize trial, and the severity of the prison sentence that takes place on that. What I should say on that one is that over and over again with witch scratchers, male or female, they always say, "I would do it again."
Right.
I felt better. This is the psychology of it. The pent up. You don't want to go too deep into psychology, but over and over again they say, "I don't care. I feel so much better since I scratched the witch."
Oh, right.
Yeah. And they're happy. It's done. Job done.
And your job too is done. So thank you very much, Owen. Brilliant talk. It's hard you can't hear the swell of the applause that's now ringing across Somerset and elsewhere. I'm in Somerset. I can just about hear it. Folks, before you all depart, just to let you 2 things actually. One is that you are going to be asked to fill in an evaluation form for the talk. We'd like to know what you thought of it, whether we could have done it better, or whether it was just so marvellous you'd just like to hear Owen again. Whatever, anything you want to say, we'd love to hear. And the second thing I'd like to say